Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here on the Washington, D.C. waterfront at the Anthem for an extraordinary conference, NATO Engages, sponsored by the Atlantic Council, the German Marshall Fund, and the Munich Security Conference. An extraordinary day of panel discussions commemorating the 70th anniversary of the Atlantic Alliance of NATO that was formed on April the 4th, 1949, with the Washington Treaty that brought together 12 nations that served as the core of what are now 29 nations that constitute the Atlantic Alliance. And I'm honored to have with us a bipartisan team of Hans Binnendijk and Dov Zakheim. Dr. Dov Zakheim, I must say, and anybody who's frequently listens to our podcast will hear Dov, and his one-time Columbia PhD advisor, who was none other than Dr. Gordon Adams, an affiliation. And you two have been a click and clack team since the early 1970s, so I'm going to ask you guys a question about that, and you wild and crazy guys in Europe back then at the height of the Cold War. We heard from Jens Stoltenberg, extraordinary address, joint session of Congress, first leader of an international organization, and also the first Norwegian, former Prime Minister, obviously, of Norway. And then Mike Pence, the Vice President, spoke here as well. Hans, I want to start with you. I mean, you taught this stuff at National Defense University. You've been a thinker on the Atlantic Alliance for a very long time. Talk to us a little bit about the messages we heard, what we heard from Jens Stoltenberg on this important commemoration, and what we heard from the Vice President. And Dov, I want to get your sense as well.
Well, Stoltenberg's basic message was we've had 70 years of NATO. It has been adapting through that period. And it continues to adapt, and it is going to be more important in the future because the challenges that we have are pretty much unknown, and we have to prepare for an array of different challenges. But I think more than his message, what I took away from the joint session, and also from the discussion that he had here with us, was the bipartisan support that he got, the standing ovations that he got on the Hill, the support that he got from this group here at the Atlantic Council, Munich Security Conference, and German Marshall Fund event. It was really the response that he got. People have been waiting for this message. Could not have given us a better birthday present for NATO when its 70th anniversary.
So how would you grade how Vice President Pence did as well? Because, and I'm also going to come back around and ask you after Dov gets his take on the naughty question that you asked Stoltenberg to put him on the spot a little bit.
All right, so I think the good news in Vice President Pence's discussion was that he said nice things about NATO. And in this environment, with this administration, that's not bad. So there were a lot of statements of support. The downside was he really went after two allies in a big way, especially Germany, on their defense spending, which actually is justified to some degree, and on Nord Stream 2, and also on the Highway 5G issue. So he really, if you had to look for a core of the Vice President's message, it was kind of in a broadside against Germany. That's not good diplomacy. That's not good diplomacy. You may agree with him on the substance, but the way he did it, to me, is counterproductive.
And full disclosure, German Foreign Ministry is also one of the sponsors of this great event, along with almost all the think tanks in Washington. And you two have various affiliations, including with the Atlantic Council. Dov, you're a great commentator. You wrote a piece about being the skunk at the garden party. Talk to us a little bit about your interpretation of what you heard, what we heard from Stoltenberg, and what we heard from the Vice President.
Well, maybe I should start with the piece, because I think that as background will give you a feel for how I take both Stoltenberg and the Vice President. Look, NATO's got its problems. You've got Orban in Hungary, you've got Erdogan in Turkey, you've got the Italian government. These are all people who are playing footsie with the Russians. And then you've got our president, who keeps dumping on NATO. He hasn't recently, but he sends Pence out to say nice things about NATO. This is not the first time the Vice President's done that. But then look at the contrast. As Hans just pointed out, the Secretary General of NATO gets standing ovations. He speaks here, he gets applauded. Vice President speaks here, and he keeps pausing for applause, and nobody claps their hands. Why? Because you don't dump on your allies at a time when you're supposed to be celebrating an alliance. There are other ways to deal with this. And oh, by the way, one might have responded to the Vice President, yes, maybe the Germans shouldn't be buying Russian gas, But how come the United States has such a trade relationship with China, which we all agree could be our long-term adversary? I just feel that, as Hans put it, this was not, and I'm no diplomat. No one's ever accused me of being diplomatic. I just felt that this was not a diplomatic way to approach our allies at a time when we're supposed to be celebrating the alliance.
You know, and the real challenge here is, you know, the Vice President was talking about something that a lot of people have been talking about. I've been writing about it for more than 15 years, about why it's important for the United States to bring its NATO allies together to look at the challenge from China in particular, given that that's going to be a geostrategic challenge. What I want to get from both of you is, how do you guys gauge the health of the North Atlantic Alliance? Younger people look at our generation and say, look, you guys are overreacting, you're talking about the death of the alliance. We're convinced that it's actually going to be a more vibrant, it's going to be a closer relationship. But if you actually look at demographic trends, the immigration from Asia and from Latin America is changing the American demographics. So it's not as much of a European population. That third generation people want to go and visit their family in the Netherlands or go to Sweden, for example, or wherever, Germany, England. And that dynamic is changing, which folks say is going to change the U.S. relationship with Europe. How do you assess, Hans, the health of the North Atlantic Alliance, and what should both sides of the Atlantic be doing to strengthen the relationship from your standpoint?
Right, so I guess first we need to note that over these 70 years, the alliance has gone through a series of crises. We had the Suez Crisis, we had Vietnam, we had the Iraq invasion, et cetera. We got over all of that.
Pershing, I mean, there were a whole bunch of other things as well.
The cruise missile Pershing deployments in the early 80s. And we got through those. The alliance survives and has made it through all of that in a relatively healthy way. But two former American ambassadors to NATO just issued a report which said NATO at 70, alliance in crisis. There was no question mark behind that statement. They list 10 different parts of this crisis, beginning with American leadership, the burden sharing issue, populist governments in Europe, et cetera. So these are all issues, these are big issues that we've got to work our way through. I think those of us who have been with the alliance for all these years look at this and we say, this may be a tougher crisis than those previous crises. We're going to make it through. I'm an optimist, but we have a lot of work to do. So it's extremely important in this environment to be diplomatic. And that was not what we saw today with the Vice President.
Dov?
Well, I think that we are in a very serious crisis. It may well be the worst crisis we faced. Clearly, we have to rethink how we interact with our allies. Now, there are precedents. You talked about the fact that the societal makeup of our country is changing. That's true. But I remember when the Prime Minister of Spain told me that every time he went to any Hispanic community, they were just wildly enthusiastic. There are ways to reach out to our minority communities that we simply haven't exploited. Now, under the current administration, which doesn't want to even deal with our minority communities, that may not happen. But again, if you look in the longer term, it seems to me that the value of the alliance is still there. The Russian threat is certainly not going away. The Chinese threat, our allies are beginning to realize it's a threat to them too. And just wait until global warming really opens up that Northwest Passage and the Chinese are all over Europe. And oh, by the way, they already are. They're buying up ports in Europe. So there is still, and there will be, a certain degree of common interest that's not going to go away. So yes, maybe our European heritage may not be exactly the same, but it's still going to be there. The interests are going to be there. The concerns are going to be there. And so it's a matter of essentially working our way through current crises and recognizing that there's still enough to keep us together. Maybe we have to wait another 2 years. Maybe we have to wait another 6. But what's that in a scan of what could be over 100 years?
Let me make one other point about NATO in crisis. A couple of months ago, the House of Representatives in the United States voted with only 22 people, all Republicans, voting against, to prohibit the use of appropriated funds to terminate the NATO alliance. It's a very strong statement of support. The more interesting question is, why did they feel they had to do that? It's because there is this notion out there that this president might do something irrational. I did a little article the other day which looked at life without NATO. It was kind of a thought experiment. What would life be without NATO? And if you think about that question, the consequences are severe. You've got issues relating to deterrence failing. You've got American loss of power militarily, economically, politically. You've got Europe in trouble because NATO is an integrating factor. The disintegration we see in Europe would be accelerated. There are consequences in Asia. If you can't trust the United States to stand up behind NATO, what about the Japan Treaty? What about the Korean Treaty? What about Australia? Those alliances are going to be meaningless. And finally, NATO is the cornerstone for what we call the international liberal order. It's about democracy, rule of law. If NATO goes away, that could well fall with it.
The fundamental bargain that we have with our allies, primarily in Europe, although also in Asia, is that we protect them and deter enemies, but if deterrence fails, we fight on their soil. That is a tremendously valuable bargain for the United States. You can't measure that in percentages of GDP, but that is simply not well understood. Where have we fought our last wars? When was the last time we fought a war on our territory?
Let me ask very quickly, because we're at the end of our battery life and they're tearing down. 1 minute from each of you. Is U.S. influence already waning? You heard Florence Parly, the French defense minister, say it's Article 5, not Article F-35. We've given a démarche to the Germans that you are not going to buy Chinese 5G. The Germans have said we're going to press ahead with that. We told the Italians you're not going to do one belt, one road with the Chinese. They pressed ahead with it. Is American influence already waning, and how do we deal with that kind of an environment?
I would say yes, it is waning. You've just given a couple of examples. You can talk about the Turkish issue as well with the S-400. If you want to have influence in the alliance, they have to have confidence in you, in your ability to defend them and to develop policies which are not inconsistent with their interests. Right now, the confidence in America in Europe now is at an all-time low. You look at polls, the UK, 20%, Germany, the Netherlands, 10%. 20 to 10% confidence in the United States. That is abysmal. I've never seen that before in the history of the alliance.
Dov?
Well, if we decide that we're going to basically remove ourselves from the world, what do you expect? And essentially, that's what's been said. America first, make America great again, all that stuff. What do you expect our European allies to think? It's recoverable, there's no question. We've recovered in the past. But right now, we're just digging the hole deeper and deeper, which makes it harder to recover when the time will come.
Dov Zakheim, Hans Binnendijk, guys, thanks very much. Really appreciate it. And next time we'll have you on because I have to talk about what your guys' relationship and how it all started. Dov, thanks. It's always a pleasure. Hans, always a pleasure. Thanks very, very much. Thanks.